Alright, yeah, welcome back on into some more Magic Arena. So, we are back for our weekly deck series once more. And this week we're going to be doing something a little special because it's not something that I do very often. I'm actually going to be showcasing a deck that was heavily inspired by another YouTuber and friend of the channel. So, this week we're going to be taking a look at Thelona Lifegain. So, before I get into this, I want to give a quick shout out to the original brainchild of this particular deck, Thelona. I'll leave a link in the description of this video to his channel. I highly recommend you guys go check him out. He's a jank connoisseur like myself, so you can expect to see a lot of really interesting, quite budget in a lot of cases as well. A lot of interesting deck designs, similar to my own, but with his own little twist on them. So this particular list, you might be upset to hear, it revolves around Nexus of Fate, but we'll get to that a little bit later. We're actually running specifically around Primal Amulet. This is the engine to the deck. Now, Primal Amulet says that instants and sorcery spells cost 1 less to cast, and it's for 4 mana. So you want to play this on turn 5 so that you can hold open something, at least to trigger it once. Maybe even on turn 6, so you can actually hold open Supreme Will. That kind of thing. You want to be able to protect this, because if you can protect it for the turn that it goes down, and untap with it, you can flip it almost consistently the next turn. And when you can't do that, you only have to cast 4 spells. You may notice that our deck is actually full of cantrips, and for those who don't know what the word cantrip actually means, it's basically a card that replaces itself. So we've got Opt, which is a 1 blue mana scry 1 draw a card. We've got Revitalize, which is a 2 mana gain 3 life draw a card. We've got Anticipate, which is look at 3 cards, put one into your hand, essentially replace itself with another. We've got Renewed Faith, which cycles and then draws a card. We've got Rejuvenation, which gains 4 life and draws a card. You're seeing a theme here. So we want to be doing a lot of cantripping to flip Primal Amulet, and once we flip it, it becomes Primal Wellspring. Now, Primal Wellspring says we can add 1 mana of any colour. Oh, matchmaking for new games has been... What? Alright, fair enough. Well, I've already recorded today's deck anyway. So, before I was rudely interrupted, add 1 mana of any colour. When that mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery spell, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So essentially, we double up anything that we use Primal Wellspring mana with, which suddenly means that things like Opt actually draw a card. They're actually saying Opt, scry 1 twice, draw a card twice. So Revitalize is gain 6 life, draw 2 cards. That kind of thing. So not only are we replacing the card, we're also adding another once we've flipped the Primal Amulet. And it gets crazy from there. It gets super crazy. Like our Supreme Wills are not a hard counter. They're a counter unless they pay 3. With the Wellspring, they're now counter unless you pay 6. We can also use it to dig 8 cards deep into our deck to go find a card. And that's very important, because in addition to all of the cantripping we're going to be doing, that's a lot of deck thinning. We're going to get down to about 30 or so cards. You may hear this a lot with Turbo Fog. When they get to 30 cards, they usually win. And that's because Nexus of Fate is a thing in this deck. So Nexus of Fate, many of you are probably aware of this one. Nobody likes this card. I can understand why, because this deck exploits the living crap out of it. So 5 and 2 blue for an instant speed. Take an extra turn after this one. So 7 mana to take an extra turn is quite a lot. However, if Nexus of Fate were put in the graveyard, it also gets shuffled back into the library. So there's an upside there. We'll play it, and there's a chance that we actually just draw it next turn. Or we draw one of the other 2 copies. We don't need 4 in this deck. Honestly, we can go infinite turns with just 3. And we use that with Primal Amulet's Wellspring to actually take an extra turn. It also reduces the cost of Nexus of Fate as well. So it actually means that it costs 6 if we haven't flipped our Primal Amulet. And we can chain Nexuses or Nexi together in order to flip our Wellspring over and start using it that way. We win by using Aetherflux Reservoir, and we do this quite slowly. Because we are actually cantripping with a lot of life gain involved, it seems only reasonable that we should use Aetherflux Reservoir to actually win the game. So 4 mana for an artifact. Whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn, and then you pay 50 life. Aetherflux Reservoir deals 50 damage to any target. So We might have to get to 100 life because our opponent could have the Shalai. She gives hexproof to players, so we do technically sometimes have to get to 100 life, but that's not a problem because when we play Efflux Reservoir, the chances are that we've already gone infinite, because this deck actually can relatively consistently play all Primal Amulets and flip all of them in the same game, which means that we're chaining Nexus of Fates for up to 5 extra turns with 7 mana, and you can imagine at that point your opponent should disappear. They should quit, they should stop playing Magic, they should be gone. But we survive as well in the early game. This deck is an absolute monster against creature decks. If your opponent's playing a creature-based deck, they should scoop immediately. I think the only exception to that, for me, has been either if I've not found a board wipe, which we delay with Revitalized, Renewed Faith, and Rituals. We delay, gaining tons of life until we get the Fumigate, which gains us more life. We wipe the board, they've got no cards in hand, we play an amulet, we flip it, we win. That's basically the usual loop for this deck. The only exception that I've ever had for that is against Mono Green Stompy. If they're able to get to the Steel Leaf Champions, the 3 mana 5/4s, Leaf. Yeah, these guys here. Sometimes they can get 2 of these down by turn 4, and that's honestly too much for us to keep up with a lot of the time. If we don't have our Supreme Will or our Commit to Memory to slow them down, that can often deal a lethal amount. But that's been, for me, the only exception to the rule as far as playing against creature decks in Game 1. So other than that, you're almost guaranteed to take Game 1 against a creature deck, because this deck is disgusting. We do have a little bit of memery in this deck as well. Sanguine Sacrament, because no deck that I ever play is complete without a little bit of memery. So X and 2 white, for an instant speed, you gain twice X life. Put Sanguine Sacrament on the bottom of its owner's library. We do have ways of shuffling our deck, so getting this back is kind of frequent. We also put a lot of cards to the bottom, so often we'll actually cycle our deck and see this 2 or 3 times in a game. It's just that crazy. This is probably completely unnecessary to the deck, but I find it kind of fun to Sanguine Sacrament off of several Primal Wellsprings, gaining like Sanguine Sacrament X7 copied 4 times, that kind of thing. Some crazy stuff. So that's essentially the deck anyway. The plan is basically to thin, get up to Primal Amulet, flip 1, take extra turns, and then take infinite turns off of that. Because once we've actually flipped Primal Amulet and we copy something like a Supreme Will with it, we actually get to go 8 cards deep, find a card. As long as we hit like a Nexus of Fate, we keep chaining it off. But if we don't, then we hit like Anticipates and things like that, and we just keep on going. It's a never-ending cycle of misery for our opponent. We do have 2 copies of Commit to Memory as well as a final card in the deck. Kind of, I would say it's probably the most important card in this deck, for a few reasons, really. Commit allows us to hard counter a card in the late game for a start. It allows us to put target spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top, which is as good as removing it, because by the time we're committing something, it's likely that we're going to be nexusing pretty soon anyway. But Memory is actually the reason why we want to run this card. 6 mana, 4 and 2 blue for an Aftermath, which means we cast it from our graveyard. It says each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 cards. So the reason why this card is so important is because, 1, it actually gets back all of our Primal Amulets and Reservoirs. It allows us to not lose if our opponent is main boarding Abrades. In fact, our opponent main boarding Abrades doesn't really do too much, unless we really need that Primal Amulet cost reduction at a given time, you know, like stuck on 4 mana with Fumigate that we need, and then the Abrade. That's probably the only exception. But Memory allows us to refill our hands, and if we can refill our hand with a flipped Primal Wellspring, then we get 7 cards in hand, which allows us to almost guaranteed cantrip our way back into the next eye, and just keep on going like that, just churn through the deck until there's nothing left. So, Commit to Memory, really solid here. It refuels us and saves us from just losing to main board removal. So that's essentially the deck. Let's go on to the land base. We got 8 plains, 8 islands. So a nice even split. We got 4 copies of Glacial Fortress and 2 irrigated farmlands as well. The cycling on irrigated farmland is the reason to run this. It's basically another discard draw effect, so it's even on our lands. You could argue to add another farmland, maybe even 4. I've been running just 2, and that's been running just fine for me, so I've got no reason to use the rest of my wildcards on any more of that. And 2 copies of Field of Ruin as a shuffle effect if we need it, but also to destroy non-basic lands such as Canter, such as enemy eat Field of Ruins if they're tapped out. You know, we can protect our Primal Wellsprings using a Field of Ruin on occasion. So that's the main board. Onto the sideboard. So basically, main board, we're suited to take care of creatures. Sideboard is pretty much just to either solidify that victory in game 2 with things like Settle the Wreckage, which is a 4-mana board wipe, exiles all attacking creatures target player controls, and then they search the library for that many basic lands, put them onto the battlefield, and shuffle. We can also deal with Planeswalkers, with Cast Out, deal with Graveyard Hate, with Silent Gravestone. Cards in graveyards can't be the target of spells and abilities. We don't really interact with our graveyard in any meaningful way. The only way that we do interact with our graveyard is by casting Memory, and Silent Gravestone does not stop us from doing that, because we're not actually targeting a spell or using an ability to target something in the graveyard. We're just casting a spell, so it's actually exempt from Silent Gravestone. So these are here mainly for Torrential Gearhulks and for Lilianas in the blue-black controls, Scarab Gods, those kind of things. Really, really big bad boys. Getting shut off on turn 1 is really good. For the control decks, we do have Jace's Defeat, 1 and a blue for an instant speed count, a target blue spell, so it's essentially a disallow for 1 mana less, and it's not even intensive on the blue. If it was a Jace Planeswalker spell, which is very unlikely to happen, then we get to scry 2, so largely irrelevant. 4 copies of Negate as well for control, because we really don't care to counter most things, to be honest. And if they've got a creature, I don't care, because we're gaining tons of life. We really just want to use negates to counter spells, to counter planeswalkers, and anything of that sort. Everything else is a catch-all with Cast Out, 3 and a white for a flash, which means instant speed, enchantment, which removes a non-land permanent an opponent controls until Cast Out leaves the battlefield. But we also have a cycling effect on it for 1 white mana, which allows us to discard and draw, which yet again plays into our strategy all the same. It's still thinning if we don't need the Cast Out. Finally, we've got 1 copy of Approach of the Second Sun. If we're playing against black decks that are running Lost Legacy, they can name Nexus of Fate, or they can name Aetherflux Reservoir, I believe, if they have Dispossess, that kind of thing. So Approach of the Second Sun is basically just an alternative win condition. It pretty much means that we don't need Primal Amulet, we don't need Reservoir, we don't need Nexus of Fate or anything like that. We can just survive until we can approach twice in a game. That's the idea anyway. So that's going to be the deck anyway, guys. As I mentioned previously, be sure to check out Thalona's channel. I'll leave a link in the description to his video, so you can go check out the original version. Other than that, I will be posting some matches with this particular deck as well. And if you'd care to like and subscribe, you get to support the channel, which means I get to make more wonderfully not wonderful for my opponent decks in the future. And yeah, hit that little bell icon, you'll get notifications when I release new videos as well. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the games.